Good evening, and welcome to the final intellectual publics of the academic year. Yay. My name is Ken Wissoker, and I direct the program, which comes from CUNY, the Graduate Center. And I'm very excited to be joined tonight by Denise Cruz, and we're going to talk in a few minutes about publishing and writing and thinking about one's own writing in a good way. But first, I want to thank Dr. Chelsea Largent, just PhD receiving, for steering the program entirely through the pandemic, where we had to reinvent it for this Zoom webinar format, and Stephanie Giet, who will be taking the lead for the next year. I also want to acknowledge that this is a kind of tough day. We lost the brilliant queer Americanist scholar Beth Freeman, who many of us have learned from. I had the privilege of working with her on 4 books, having met her when she was still a grad student, a story we will come back to today. She was only 58 with so much more to think and say and do. So condolences to others who might be feeling in a similar way. Denise and I are going to talk for till about maybe 20 of 8 East Coast time, and then there'll be time for questions. So the chat is open, but if you would put your questions in the Q&A specifically, that'll make it easier for us to find them. Denise is chair of the Department of English and Comparative Literature and professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University. I might be mistaken, but I believe the first woman of color to hold such a position. Is that correct? Not a hard guess, but there we are. She's the author of the fabulous book Trans-Pacific Femininities, The Making of the Modern Filipina, which we published at Duke in 2012. She and I originally met at the Ford Foundation, where she was a predoctoral dissertation and postdoctoral fellow. And her work on the transnational Philippines, originally through thinking about the role that women writers had in producing a kind of Philippine transnational in an English language form, and the forms of femininity and feminism that coalesced around that has been very influential. She's working on a book now, I think 2 books now, but one on the rise of global Philippine fashion and fashion design, which is going to be amazing. Before arriving at Columbia, she taught at the University of Toronto in the Department of English, and before that in English and American Studies at Indiana University in Bloomington. She was the 2021 recipient of Columbia's Presidential Teaching Award and the Mark Van Doren Teaching Award. And just a really innovative, if you've seen any of the videos of the flash mobs in Toronto in the lecture courses, a very innovative teacher, writer, and thinker. And I'm really just a great friend, and I'm really happy to have her join me tonight for this discussion about writing. Denise, welcome.
Thanks so much, Ken. It's so great to be in community with you here and everyone here today. I'm really excited for this conversation. And I've been thinking over the course of the last few days as we prepared for it, just reflecting back on our friendship and our work together as, with you as my editor, but also, just the work we've done really in thinking about mentoring other writers, which is something I think that has been really pivotal to your work as an editor at Duke. And Ken is right. We met when I was a graduate student at the Ford Foundation, or just after graduate school, in my first year at Indiana. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But for now, since we do have people joining us from all over, Ken, and maybe if we could start by having you talk a little bit about your work as an editor. So this is, and especially as an editor working with authors of first books. So if we could fine tune it a little bit.
Yeah, well, it's a very interesting job because the thing that it involves least is what comes to mind the most, like which is like line editing, which some editors, some acquisitions editors do, but um, most university press editors don't have time for, or it's not actually the skill. For me, like what I think about is curation. You know, there's hundreds and hundreds of really smart books out there all the time that one could publish. So, but for a press, we publish 150 books a year at Duke. So, which ones make sense to publish? Where do you see something that is kind of book by book building a recognizable list? So a combination of curation and then the part I think that's more relevant tonight, which is the doula part, which is
Mhm.
helping somebody see what their ideas are. I love the part that's the dialogue, that's hearing something in what someone's saying and trying to um, get them to say it in a stronger way, to kind of own the idea more fully rather than tentatively, and figure out how does that arrange itself over a book, which is so different than the way it might arrange itself in a dissertation or other forms of reporting on what one has learned.
Mhm.
So that's the kind of central part, but the other more formal part is also running a review process. So part of what's central to me is thinking of the review process not as a kind of barrier, but as a kind of part of the form of getting a book into shape. So I look for people who would actually like the book and what are the feedback they can give to make the book better. And you've reviewed many times, lots of people who are authors review, but other people who've never had anything else to do with the press, but actually care about the subject. So
Mhm.
you're really trying to get something from its germ either as a different form, like a dissertation,
Mhm.
or an essay, or just an idea of like, wow, I had this idea that like, what if you think about this way? And to turn that into a book that could have the best chance of reaching as many people as possible.
Thanks so much. So I would love to talk about all of those stages, the curation, the mentoring, and the review process. But picking up on that last point, and part of what we're talking about is how to create a book that will have impact in the world, or how a writer comes to a book that they feel like will be impactful. And I think one of the things that I remember you saying to me, and I've heard you say to others, is advice really about how to imagine your audience or how to think about one's audience. And I think people would be really interested in hearing from you about how advice you have for writers as they consider their audience, especially
Mhm.
as they move from that germ of a dissertation or a article or an idea in their head to thinking about a book and the audience it might have, and maybe to fine tune it even further. If you could tell us an example uh, of a writer who in the process of revising really hit upon their audience in a way that was exciting for you.
Well, I think often when one, especially at a dissertation where it's really clear you have an audience of 5 or 6
Mhm.
people, you need to expand your audience from there. But there's something about the form and audience of dissertation that works together to really like think about like, oh, I'm doing this work. It's a holdover from positivism, I think. Like,
Mhm.
oh, no one's written about these Filipino novels, so I'm going to
Mhm.
write about these. And then you get some ideas out of it, but then is the audience just the other people who wrote about the things on either side of that niche? Is it only other people interested in those novels? Or is there something bigger to say? And I think a lot of times people get very stuck in the I'm writing for the people closest to my subject,
Mhm.
as if like it was all kind of digging in deeper into some historical node and the only audience was other people working on that exact thing. But that's rarely anybody's, if you ask somebody who's it for, that's rarely their ambition. And making the change in the writing and thinking, so you're thinking about who are the wider people who might be impacted in this, that's a very difficult thing to do because it requires a lot of unlearning and a lot of imagining. So I try and think about tricks that might be helpful. And one of the best ones is, I think, to get rid, there was a book, it's kind of mid last century, called like The Reader Over Your Shoulder. It was kind of very New Yorker writers kind of thing. But I always think of that figure and people, how often people have the person on their committee who is least likely to like their work, or the person in the field least likely to like their work, or the critical critic, or even, today with Beth's passing, the Critical Inquiry, the journal from Chicago, recirculated a blog that she had written after Lauren Berlant passed, and the kind of way that she felt like Lauren's passing means that a lot of her students who had hoped to someday write something Lauren would like and would be excited about were now released from that obligation. It's a very moving piece because it's both about mentorship and co-writing, and then also having to kind of let go or move on. And I try and refocus people on who are the people entering your grad school cohort as you're leaving. Who are the people entering, if you're writing your fourth book, who are people entering grad school now? What do they already know? What are they excited about? What's going to like move them along politically or intellectually from the place they already are, rather than trying to get a recalcitrant senior person to actually allow that place might exist. And I feel like a lot of what weighs books down is often trying to get the reader to the place most actual readers are starting. It's like, okay, let's just assume we're all on the same page here. How are we going to move from here? What are your ideas? And that means imagining a set of readers that you'd really love to have, who could be excited about it. But sometimes, and this maybe gets to your question about an example, it involves imagining readers you haven't thought of. The example I always go to for that is somebody else I met at the Fords, who's now also a senior person, Noinoi Silva at University of Hawaii, who, when she was writing the book that became Aloha Betrayed, which is a kind of history of the US occupation of Hawaii around turn of the 20th century, and the way Hawaiian nationals had a petition to kind of keep that from happening. And over 90% of living Hawaiian Native people signed the petition, and it stopped the Senate from annexing Hawaii until the Spanish-American War, when it was like, oh, we need this naval station. Sorry. But the book, which really changed a lot about how Native Hawaiians felt about their history and what their ancestors had done at this crucial time of US imperialism, Noina thought she was writing it for them. And when we met and we were at the Fords, and I was like, everybody in American Studies is going to want to read this. And she was like, why? No. Because she had an audience that was already a public audience, that was already people outside the academy. But then the number of places that the book took off, I think it won like a prize from the Academy of Religion. She came and toured around like a whole bunch of different conferences because there was something in that kind of revision of the understanding and the political action and what it meant at the time that lots and lots of people found valuable. So if you think like you're writing, you can think broadly, and then you can also, and this is part of the discussion with the press, and one thing I didn't mention that is my job is to present it to marketing. So I'm kind of imagining that further And that's what you hope for, is the book that takes off even beyond the audience you've imagined for it.
I mean, I think, that example also points to, I mean, what I see and read in a lot of Duke books, the urgency of the voice, the urgency of the project, the deep commitment to it, and the ability to make, a book that is deeply historical, for example, or something that is really able to extend beyond a small audience to one that's potentially quite larger. And I think the advice of figuring out who that audience is, and maybe having multiple readers too. So your future graduate students, your undergraduate students, your people in the community. I think that's something that is incredibly helpful. If we could switch gears a little bit and talk about how we even get to the stage of working with you, or how a writer gets to that stage of working with you. Because say a writer has that audience in mind and has the dream of a book in mind, and I often hear that one of the hardest things for first authors is to really start the process, and there's different ideas about that. So some people, I've seen people, for example, really get so committed to writing a proposal and they don't send anything out, or don't contact any editors, or don't have that conversation until they have that proposal really locked in. And our relationship, or our writer-editor relationship, was very different, because I think, I actually pulled my email to you on August 30th of 2007, and looked through our email correspondence, where I wrote, "Dear Mr. Wissoker, my name is Denise Cruz, and I'm an assistant professor of English and American Studies at Indiana." And I say, that Celine Paranis-Chamizu, who is a colleague in the field, that she encouraged me to contact you. And I talked about what I loved about the press and the books in Philippine studies that were really meaningful. And then I asked at the end, would you be open to having a conversation at the next conference? And you wrote back within a day, which I thought was so wonderful. And it began an extended back and forth about my work. So I guess the question is, can you talk a little bit about the different routes that people take to that kind of meeting, or to that correspondence? I mean, sometimes, sure, it's meeting at a conference, but I'm sure also sending in a proposal or submitting on the website.
Absolutely, because first of all, every editor is different, because it's an affective relation. So how you meet different people is going to be different. And I have colleagues, you'd be just as happy to meet them at a reception, and they'd be going around introducing themselves at a conference. I like to get emails ahead of conferences, as you did, but nobody needs to recommend anybody. It's just it's really important to say you don't need a Dean Shimizu to write on your behalf. You can just have like your own idea and write about it. We have instructions where you can put up a proposal and a sample chapter or two through our website, and every Friday I go over that with the two women I work with in my office, both of whom really smart, with PhDs in women's studies, and for one, and ethnomusicology for the other. And we just talk about them, and we see like, oh, what's going on here? Can we figure out what's exciting about it? Does it fit what we're looking for? Do we think it might sell enough to be, good? All those things. So, if you're going to be at a conference, it's definitely worth trying to set up time for a coffee, or finding out if I don't like standing in the booth and then having people come up, but I know there are editors who will stand there all day and just talk to people as they come by. So that's a very good way. Writing to somebody and sending a proposal and a sample, and then following up and seeing, do they want to have a Zoom about it? Is it possible to talk in some other place or way, is really good. There's not really a single right way. And the proposals have gotten very kind of cemented as a way of doing it, but it's really just a way of conveying who you are and what your project is. And that could be done well in an email, that could be done in lots of different forms. I don't think any editors I've ever talked to really need the email where you ask if you could send the proposal, because that requires being the good person who writes back the next day twice. So like you could write the email and include the proposal. You could go to the press's website and see what they say to do, which might well be to put it in um, through a web portal, as ours is.
Mhm.
But if you have a chance to meet and talk with editors, it really is a long relationship. You know, you and I have been at this a long time, but even if one is just working with an editor on one book, that's going to be 3 or 4 years over
Mhm.
the time of first meeting until the book comes out. So that's a pretty substantial relationship. And you want to feel like, oh, this person gets what I'm doing. They could
Mhm.
explain it to somebody else. They're really efficient. They're going to move things through really quickly. They understand what my needs are for my tenure timeline, and they're like being aware of that. All the things that somebody might require, they appreciate creativeness. They're also tired of creative strategies and would like to just have a more, let's get this monograph done in the traditional way approach. Like whatever you're looking for, you want to
Mhm.
find somebody who is going to be similarly inclined, and you feel like, oh, this will go smoothly or as smoothly as possible.
I love that you ended with thinking about what an author might be looking for in an
Mhm.
editor, because I feel like sometimes people approach the process as if, that they don't really have that in mind necessarily, what kind of match would actually work in terms of making the project the best that it could be. We flip that a little bit, and can you talk about, if you can think of thousands of books that you've now published, like what are you are there any patterns in terms of the kinds of authors that really pique your interest, or is it mostly the projects themselves that pique their interest? I imagine a little bit both.
Yeah, there's definitely both. I've really tried to use my position as consistently as possible to
Mhm.
support women and women of color and people of color more generally, and um, also a lot of feminist and queer work.
Mhm.
So that is something I value and has been important to my list, and um, in different ways at different times, like Black Thought or
Mhm.
my role in Asian American Studies, or going back to Series Q and the start of queer theory. So that's been very important. But in terms of projects, and I can't really separate the two because, of course, every time
Mhm.
you're looking at something, they're both there together, who the person is and what's going on. I'm looking for something surprising. Like
Mhm.
I often feel like if you just say what the approach is and then what the object is, these novels, these films, this kinship relation, this whatever the field is, and you can predict what the person's going to say, then I feel like it's just kind of machinery clanking on, like they successfully applied
Mhm.
this paradigm develop somewhere else to this new set of things, which is often like super important. You know,
Mhm.
I did a lot of work, Karen Strassler, Chris Pinney, a whole bunch of people like rethinking the history of photography to a more global history. So you
Mhm.
wouldn't just assume it was the same Anglo-French US history of photography we'd had before. So eventually, somebody going like, oh, what about the history of photography in Burma? It's like, okay, well, it's good that somebody is doing that in this, acknowledging it's a different history, but are we learning something new that
Mhm.
how to think about it that we could use elsewhere? And trying to figure out that, is this just smart thinking in a new way about some new objects that haven't been included? And is this going to like turn and become something that everybody's like, oh, that's what I want to model my work on?
Mhm.
That's a very hard call to make often early. But
Mhm.
that's the germ of that, the idea of that is really what makes me excited about the project and thinking with the author and I'm looking for somebody I want to think with too, in exactly that same way.
Great. And I think, when people talk about working with you, I think that's one of the things that frequently comes up, the just the dialogue and conversation and partnership, the questions that you ask, the interaction and engagement with the work. I, I think it might be helpful to talk a little bit about when people, in terms of the process of manuscript production, write to you, and because I remember, in that very first meeting, we were talking about options for the dissertation that eventually became the book, and it was so soon after, I was about a month into my first job that we had that initial conversation, and it was at the Ford Foundation conference, which was really unique as a space that allowed for that early interaction. And I remember so distinctly, and then I looked it up again, just the different routes that we were talking about. So one of, okay, revising it first, and really taking time to revise the project, or, thinking about a proposal that would flag the changes in the dissertation. Now, of course, this is back in 2007, so you might have since changed that advice. But I remember one of the great things about that conversation is almost immediately after I wrote back and said, okay, I think what I'd like to do is the proposal about prospective changes. And you wrote back and you said, okay, I'm happy to do whatever you want. I thought we were, I kind of left the conversation thinking about that it would be the revised version first, but please, it's up to you. And I thought about it, and I ended up doing the second version, and I'm so glad that I did. And I wrote back to you and said, I think I need more time, and I want to reread the work and sit with it and go back and do more research first. And that was a really pivotal moment. But I guess the question is, in general, do you have a sense of whether or not you prefer for people to have some distance from the dissertation, or is it hard to really generalize in that way?
Well, I would certainly say I've met people who I ended up publishing when they were in grad school, still writing their dissertation, or not even that far through it, that I ended up working with because we were in conversation the whole time. If I'm giving somebody a contract, we have to send things out for peer review. When I first started, I think you might have been at the tail end of what I had done early on, which was to sometimes send out dissertation versions with that kind of cover letter. But the longer I did it, I ended up feeling like it didn't make better books. It did help, get people a contract which was good for their careers, which is part of what I want to help. But in terms of the books themselves, I think when the readers would give feedback on the dissertation version, then they would assume that's the frame that the writer wanted, and then would say, what needs to happen to this to make it a publishable book? And it really shortcut a lot of the rethinking that allows somebody to get out of the frame that's often kind of accidental or historically contingent that forms what's in the dissertation, and really get to like, what's my big question? What am I trying to say? What do the chapters need to be to say that? And so I've really moved much more to trying to get people to figure out, what are you trying to convince people of? What are you trying to argue? What's the story you want to tell? I mean, there's different ways of coding it in different genres that are partly disciplinary and partly writerly. What do you want people to come away from this from this? And then what would they need to be convinced about it or get there? And I've started to compare more the dissertation version to like a lot of footage for the film. Even though people cut things out of their dissertations, sometimes, other times they write to fill them up. But either way, it's not really the kind of edited, it's much more like the footage that someone has so they can edit and decide how long each frame needs to be there, each scene needs to be there,
Mhm.
what the rhythm is, to really make a film that people would want to watch. So I'm like, now you might know what the idea is going to be at the beginning, and you might have finished, one might have finished the dissertation the easiest way to finish it. And when somebody said, oh, that paper you wrote for me, why don't you just put that in as chapter 3? You know, you did that, and you got the dissertation defended. You might have known, one might have known the whole time that wasn't going to be in the book, that the book
Mhm.
was really going to do something else. But also, I think people spend more time in the materials and rethinking. They go out on, they give talks, they teach, they give presentations, and then quite a lot of stuff that then kind of reformulates. So, like when we started talking about the fashion book, I had this idea of like, oh, maybe the fashion book will be fashion you think of like a modernist engine where we have to have like wide leg jeans this year, and we'll be back in skinny jeans in like 2 years, and it's going to change all the time. And then you're like Philippine fashion, it's like the same shoulders all the time, but there's fashion moving
Mhm.
and it's couture. I was like, that's a great idea for a book. And then it turned out there was a much better idea for the book because you had a whole transnational industry and a whole different way of seeing that you brought to the project after we'd already talked about it as the one
Mhm.
idea. And so I feel like that a similar process happens so many times in revising that rushing to kind of take the shortcut doesn't really make that much sense. Being
Mhm.
in conversation makes total sense. Being working on what the flow is going to be and coming back and forth and checking in with me or whoever the editor is you're working with, that makes total sense.
Mhm.
But it's hard to really, a dissertation is hard won, or if you're one's working with articles, those are hard won too. And to try and get to like, does all this need to be in the book and for whom? To be able to step away enough to see that, I mean, that's one thing editors can help with and review process can help with. But I think one needs a little more sense that like what's there was there for a reason, and now what do we need?
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's so important because I think it's not about completely throwing out the dissertation or just extending it. It's thinking about the work that was necessary for you to get to the point of writing your book, that all of that research and writing and thinking was necessary and that you're now ready for it. I remember so distinctly that you know in one of our conversations, I think it's fairly standard advice for when you're writing a dissertation that you write the introduction at the end of the process because that's when you have finally figured out what you want to say. I think many writers do this.
Mhm.
And I remember after, having worked on the project a little bit more and in conversation with you about it, I think I had told you that I was, I was going to do that again. I was going to wait, and I had decided to wait until the end to write the introduction. And then you said to me, um, why don't you write it now? I feel like you're ready to write it now. And it was such a liberating piece of advice and maybe it felt so natural to you that where you said I actually think you know what you want to say and even if it's not perfect you should just try it, so just try writing the introduction. And I did, and it was really clarifying for me in terms of figuring out the project that I had and the project that I wanted it to be. And so I I guess what I'm saying is that for people in the room who are thinking about turning to their book, there's many different avenues into getting you, and it's so individual. And to try to trust and think about maybe changing the process a little bit or trying something new.
Well, when you think about voice and what's the style, like
Hmm.
who's the narrator of this book going to be? And that
Right.
goes back to the where we started with the readers. And the whole voice of the dissertation, or for that matter, the article by the senior person, is
Mhm.
really different than a voice you'd want in a book that was going to be read by activists, or a book that was going to be read by a wider community, or a book that was going to be read interdisciplinarily. So I think like the introduction is the place where you can try out different voices more
Mhm.
easily, but it also forces you to know what that argument is. So your brilliance that you actually knew what the argument is. But I think a lot of times people are like, what was the old George Clinton Funkadelic song, standing
Mhm.
on the verge of getting it on? Like people sort of like kind of are leaning toward the argument, but they
Mhm.
haven't fully stated it yet. And the exercise of writing the introduction and being in a writing group, having friends
Right.
that you're exchanging work with. So somebody will say, is what you're trying to say this? And you have to go, not quite, and figure out what it's trying to say. I think that part is really most crucial. But
Mhm.
also then, then you can, once you know that, then you can think about what needs to be in the chapters.
Mhm.
If you start with the chapters, then you're kind of retrofitting an argument over the chapters and it's
Yeah.
backwards.
Yeah.
You want to be able to convince the people of what you want to say. Then what are you going to show them? In what order? It has a different valence than if you're just like, okay, well, here are the chapters in this order. So I'm going to write an introduction. That introduction, it's just like okay, we've got the building. Now let's just have the foundation that holds up the building. But it's not moving anywhere. It's not producing anything. It's not convincing anybody of anything. So I feel I don't think the introduction anyone writes first would be their final introduction,
Mhm.
because one's thinking changes, you're working through stuff. But if you could get an idea of like, here's the voice I'm leaning into,
Right.
here's the kind of political intervention I'm trying to make in this field or more generally, then it gives you some momentum to go into the chapters, like remembering, oh, I'm that person. Oh, do we really
Right.
need this in chapter 3? Because that's kind of it's about those objects, but it's a little tangent from what the book I said was going to be doing. So
Mhm.
what's it here for?
Can we shift to talk about the review process? Since I feel that this is a topic that we don't often see described as much.
Mhm.
Um, so could you spoke a little bit about the selection process how you imagine reviewers and that you want to find reviewers who will help the project. And I think that's really important for everyone to hear that when a manuscript is sent out, it's sent out in a way that what we're trying to do is to, or what you're trying to do is to find reviewers who will make the project be the best version of itself that it can be. Um, so as you think about or select reviewers, what are you thinking of? How do you go about the process of
Mhm.
selecting the readers for a project?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing that seems obvious to me, but I think isn't obvious to people who are writing books and haven't been through the process before or haven't been asked to review book-length
Mhm.
manuscripts, it's a lot of work.
Mhm.
So if we sent out things that we didn't want to do, I'd run through like, all the goodwill Candace Chu could muster would be would be gone, and like I'd be like, no, please don't send me any more of this stuff. So we only send out things if we actually want to publish them, usually, or at least want to find out, is it as good as it seems to me? I'm not an expert in many of the fields in which I publish, or most of the fields in which I publish. So people's expertise can be helpful. But
Mhm.
really, I want the feedback that's like, oh, this is what this needs to really work better. So I compare it to the test screening for a film. Like the director invites their friends, the theater invites people everybody's excited to see the new film. And then when you fill out the thing afterwards and you're like, oh, this part dragged, or I thought that was supposed to be funny, but you know what? It didn't seem funny to me at all. Or
Mhm.
the director's watching as the audience reads. And I think of the review process as a small scale version of that. So I look for um, people who might be watching from different angles. So if it's supposed to be interdisciplinary, then somebody's coming from one area. Oh, this person's like been wanting something on the Black Pacific for a zillion years. This person knows about this genre of music, and we're going to get like each of their perspectives on what's working and not. So often what's really great in the review process is when people are coming from very different places, but the same things are not working for them. And often I like it being single blind, which is how we do it, how most book publishers do it. And often people will be like, oh, well, that person is clearly more invested in blah, 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 because they must be this kind of person. And they're almost always wrong. And it's like, I like that it's just reader number one and reader number two. And most editors, and I do this, will generally ask people like, who are your ideal readers? If you could get feedback from people, who are people you would value their feedback? And is there anyone I should stay away from? I don't want the person you broke up with in graduate school. I don't want the person you got into an argument at a talk after a panel. But people who are going to value your work, are going to care about the kind of work that you're doing and be invested in that work being good. Those are the people I look for as readers. And it's one of those things, I think we've talked about this, nobody teaches it. It's like teaching or being on committees or being department chair, like all the things that you go through graduate school, and it's like, nope, that wasn't in the pro seminar. Nope, that wasn't in the pro seminar. So people tend to write the reviews the way they receive them, but so they're very different styles of doing it. But I love reading the two together because that's usually what we look for, and seeing like where, even if people have framed it in really different ways, somebody might be like, well, there's a good idea, hit the basis of this, but it's going to need a lot of work and the other person might be like, she's such a star. I'm so excited that you might be publishing this book, blah, blah, blah. Here are just a few things they might consider before, so they could have them the frame could be in entirely opposite ways, but often the actual things that need doing are just the same. So when you can find that, or find what wasn't, what did the author think they had made clear that wasn't clear to these invested readers? So it's like, well, I thought I already explained that. It's like, well, here are people who are in the inner circle of who your readers might be, and they forgot that you had explained that the way you did in the introduction. By the time they got to chapter 3, maybe they won't be the only people who need some other method. So I feel like the most important thing is looking for what the readers didn't get rather than their solutions. And people get stuck all the time on the solutions being inappropriate solutions. But, often we ask people to read in 6 weeks. There are some people like yourself who are very timely. Other people need a lot of encouragement to finish up. And so you know that the person's thinking of those advice things while they're just trying, let me just get this done so I can get that off my to-do pile. And so they're coming up with ideas they think are helpful, and then people just focus on those ideas. I'm much more concerned with what made someone think they needed an idea there. What kind of speed bump did they hit that they made a suggestion? The suggestion might be good, the suggestion might be, there are probably lots of better suggestions or a lot better ideas of what to do, but what made them feel like something was needed there? And what could you, as the author, do in that space? So the next person who read it didn't go through that.
That's so helpful. I think that, as a reviewer, I try to offer suggestions to writers, but with no attachment to them. It's more as a writer's thinking about working with their manuscript. Here's what I might do where are you, or this is an idea, but with the complete understanding that someone can take it in a different direction. And what I love about reading the books when they come out is seeing what the writers do with the projects. And so it's, I think, really helpful to have that reminder that these suggestions are really suggestions, and sometimes they are, I think, interpreted as solutions. And I've done it myself, of like, oh my goodness, I have these recommendations. How am I going to manage all of them? It's hard to get feedback. It's helpful to, have that reminder. A question I often get asked as a mentor is what is an editor looking for in the author's response to the reviews? That's something I think that people wonder about or have anxiety about. And so I've shared before my response to readers' reports, but is there something that you particularly like to see in a response to the reports?
It's a very funny genre
Mm-hmm.
because mostly, like, if you told your kid, like, these are the things I need from the grocery store, they'd be like, okay, mom, I got it. I'll go get them. That would be
Right.
complete assent. Or you had an RA and they just went out and did everything. When people write a response to the reports, we're actually looking for their thinking rather than their assent. So it's easy. Sometimes people err on the side of like, oh yeah, I can do all that. And it's supposed to mean I've thought about the reports, and I think it genuinely does mean I thought about the reports and nothing seems like a problem. But it's a real show your work kind of situation. So that when I'm getting a response to readers' reports, I'm thinking I'm putting together a contract request, and that's going to go to Gisela Fasado, our editorial director. It's going to go to the dean of the press. It's going to go to people in marketing. They didn't meet the author at American Studies or wherever I met them. They haven't had this back and forth. They're just looking at the reviews and the person's response. So it's partly where do they get the sense of like, does this person seem like they know what needs to be done? Do they seem smart about it? Is their writing clear? And so having something that goes through the major questions that are brought up, it doesn't have to be exactly what one will do. I like that it's a perspective form. Like, oh, I see what the reader meant by the leap from chapter 2 to chapter 4 and how chapter 3 isn't really the right transition. I'm going to try flipping chapter 4 and chapter 3 as they suggested. Then if that doesn't work, I have this other idea, which could be to rewrite chapter 3 in this way. But I definitely want to make that arc go smoothly, or something that shows a kind of creative engagement with the questions one has. So I think that form is good. It doesn't have to be huge detail. You're not writing for people in the field. The response, at least at that particular stage, doesn't go back to the reviewers. So you're really writing to the editor about what you'll do. We tend to have more than one round of peer review because we like to have a sign off from the reviewers before we bring it to our faculty board. So then the reviewers might see it the next round, but then they're also seeing what the author did in response to it. So I think something that shows a kind of engagement with the things that need engaging, but not the theoretical account you might give to someone in your writing group who was pushing you on some theoretical point. And you were like, I did use Benjamin, and it blah, 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 blah. And then you have 3 paragraphs on Benjamin. Everybody at the press will be like, I don't know what they're talking. So you want to like be thinking about the form and the formal and showing that you understand what needs to be done, but it doesn't. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I'd like to talk a little bit about genre and impact, but genre. Could you reflect on the changing genres you've seen in your time at Duke, and maybe the importance of what I might call genre flexibility? So I'm thinking, for example, of of Christina Sharp or Bernadette Gonzalez or,
Mhm.
Sammy Shock. Of course, I know that, there's been a long history of um, books at Duke that have, exceeded traditional genres, but I would love to have your sense of the shape of genres at Duke during your time.
Well, it's interesting because right now, if you said, well, what book has gotten mentioned the most in the last 6 months, it's probably your late colleague Edward Said's
Mm-hmm.
Orientalism,
Mm-hmm.
which as a genre, that came out from a trade press. It had a kind of doesn't start by overwhelming you with like footnotes or anything that he
Mm-hmm.
read. He just had an idea and he had a whole career writing in a trade way as well as being a scholar. So I think that idea of um, and Saidiya Hartman the same way, like
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
somebody who's both an academic theorist of note and writes in a beautiful way that conveys their ideas to a larger public is always been an available ambition for some people. It tends to be senior people, tend to be New Yorkers more than other people, tend to be well-connected people, and there it tended to be held limited by what kinds of work interested people at Penguin or Simon
Mm-hmm.
Schuster or Forrest Strauss or whatever. And genres, disciplines, so people in American history giving narrative histories or in American literature writing biographies, it was much easier than people doing theoretical work. And I think one of the things that's really changed in the last several decades is the number of people who might be reading our work who are not academics.
Mm-hmm.
And, I could see this a lot when I've worked with Sarah Ahmed, and you would
Right.
see like when Living a Feminist Life came out, every couple of days for months and months, for like 2 years really, somebody would put the cover of the book up on Twitter saying like,
Mm-hmm.
this book is getting me through the week. This book is getting me through. And the idea of what do you need to do to get to the person who's finding out about your book through Twitter or finding out about your book through, I don't know if I ever shared with you the TikTok summary of the Twitter account of what books you need to read to understand the Philippines,
Mm-hmm.
Philippine history from Philippine History Month. Well, it's like really great, it's like
Yeah.
Martin Melanson, like everything. So, the people who are finding things that way, what makes the book readable to them?
Mm-hmm.
And as soon as you start to think about that, there's a kind of more opening of style that comes with it. And I think that's also happened because of where we find smart things. And so I like to ask people like, well, where's the smartest thing you read this week? And it might have been in a peer-reviewed article. It might have been somebody's book. But just as easily, it might have been an exchange in social media somewhere, or on
Mm-hmm.
someone's blog, or in some other kind of form of thinking that wasn't really a kind of peer-reviewed form at all. And once you separate out, once you think about the readership and you think about the ideas could be just as important theoretical interventions or historic or methodological interventions, but come across in a different way, then we get out of the kind of forms of the monograph that
Mm-hmm.
dominated these disciplines, which were always disciplinary forms. And now so many people want an interdisciplinary address. The disciplines themselves increasingly, even though people will always go to bat for their own, you know, I've never been to ASAP, which is coming to New York. Amber Musser is now president, but the Association for the Study of Arts of the Present. So instead of like, oh, the history of photography and the study of film and the study of literature and the study of art, each having their own methodologies, which are
Mm-hmm.
mostly unrelated, each following their own kind of critical paths. Oh, the same people are looking at the same works and also hearing some music, and they're also in a historical context and cultural context. So if you had to write across your ideas so they could be heard from any of those kind of disciplinary contexts, how do you have to do it? If you're trying to write for activists or people involved in abolition, or if you're writing for a larger feminist public of one sort or another, then how would you like to tell the story? If you think about, I always think in terms of going back to where you started, the ideal audience response is grad students texting each other saying, have you seen Denise's new book yet? And like the kind of way that the importance of somebody's ideas spreads like crazy in ways that aren't modernist or controllable, don't have anything to do with the presses, getting out the review copies or anything like that, but really kind of just sort of take off on their own. And I can think of lots of first books. I mean, Max Leboyron's Pollution is Colonialism, Lamar Jarrell Bruce's How to Go Mad, like books that were perfectly great books in their disciplinary niches, and then just kind of took off way beyond anything anyone expected in that way that Noise did. It's like, well, why would you write something like that as if it had the narrowest audience? Why not write for the broadest audience? The hard part, if I can turn it around, is it's hard to do. And writing in the most traditional form, here's like my literary criticism book with 5 novels by Balzac and 5 chapters, each highlighting a different aspect of Balzac's work, and an introduction talking about why a return to Balzac is very important now in our historical moment. It's a lot easier to do that. There are a lot of models. It's closer to what one's taught as a grad student. It's unlikely that people might think it's boring, but nobody will think it's like, a really big career mistake. So there's a kind of safety in the old forms. And, trying to invent your own genre is hard. So I think we were talking last week, if you go back and think about Christina Sharp's first book or Saidiya Hartman's first book, and then their second books, and then the books that really have broken out and changed forms entirely, that's a huge progression. And those are people who've worked on form the entire time. So nobody's going to like roll out of bed and wake up that way, so one has to choose a style and an experiment that one wants to work to be good at and actually be able to be good at. And that requires an ear that might get back to the writing group or the editor or the friends, whoever it is you go to, where somebody will be like, yep, this should work, but it's really, I think you're so much smarter than this feels, or something. So you know where you have to work harder at it, or where it might actually be a little better to like, okay, maybe I'll work up toward that ambition, or that I kind of imagine this complex thing, but imagining this complex genre might be easier than actually achieving it.
It's helpful to be reminded, because I think sometimes when people or initially think about books with larger impact, I think sometimes there's a tendency to think about it in terms of style primarily, or as one of the most important aspects of a book that can break out into a larger public. But what you have just reminded us of is the importance of a book like Sarah Ahmed's or Christina Sharp's or Saidiya Hartman's as being fundamentally about innovative ideas and ideas that take hold and capture a larger imagination. And I think that's hard. I think that's hard, especially as someone's developing their work or developing their ideas. And yes, Ken is reminding everyone to put questions in the chat, because we are hoping to turn to Q&A at some point soon. what is, it can, maybe as people are thinking about questions, as I think what we're turning to, oh, here is one, but as we're, maybe I'll just move to this question because
No,
actually,
you
Eric,
keep going.
okay, because I will eventually, Eric, I see your question because you're actually asking one of the questions that I wanted to ask. Um, right. So I guess, you know, I think it might be helpful for people to hear, you know, this as you're working with authors who have just an idea or a kernel of an idea that they are that is surprising to you, or that will have, you know, that will have that wider impact. Can you think of an example, or can you tell us an example of that as someone who maybe came to you with an idea and you're like, I don't really know how that would work, but it was curious, you know, it was enough to spark your curiosity, and it ended up becoming incredible.
Well, actually, I mean, now it seems very obvious, but when Alexis Gums, who I had
Mm-hmm.
talked to about her dissertation becoming a book, just sent me what became Spill. And the idea was
Mm-hmm.
she had read Hortense Spillers, that's the title, and had been writing little poems in response to ideas of Hortense. I was like, that seems like a weird framework, you know?
Mm-hmm.
I was just like, everybody would love to know what you think with Hortense's ideas. And then when she sent me the actual thing, I was like, oh, I see what's going on here. So then it was like, you have this rubric, this kind of way of prompting what you want to say. But then
Mm-hmm.
when you're actually saying it, you're really saying it. But it's another interesting example because the three books of poetry we did in succession, M Archive and Dub, each one is like a whole quantum leap up from where they
Mm-hmm.
are. And if you didn't know the same person had written Spill and M Archive, maybe you could figure that out from its commitments, but it wouldn't be formal. It wouldn't be just from like, oh, that's that person's poetry or that's that person's style. Um, so that would be one example. But I think there are also, we were talking earlier about our, sorry for the haunting of the day, but our late friend Dawn Mabalon,
Mm-hmm.
who I also met at the Fords, and I think she was still finishing her dissertation. And she wrote about um, Filipino Stockton and
Mm-hmm.
what a huge center it was, and people arriving in San Francisco from the Philippines to go to work would be like, just get me out of San Francisco and get me to Stockton. And the
Mm-hmm.
whole project she had of recovering that and the way it had been urban renewed away. And at first I didn't hear it. I was like, okay, well, that's an interesting
Mm-hmm.
history of this one place. I didn't see the larger nationalness of it. It was only like as it kind of took form and then the kind of archive grew and grew and I could see like how rich it was. So sometimes I feel like I'm just slow, you know, because a really new idea is really new. And
Yeah.
you have to like be able to see how powerful it is. Other times the idea is there, and this gets to the difference in how people write, because some people revise their way toward the idea. Um, Deborah Thomas, the famous anthropologist who's at UPenn, her first book, um, which came out of her dissertation, didn't have like the title concept, didn't have like the main concept, which is like how does like the Creole aspiration of Jamaican independence turn into a cynical black nationalism? That idea came last. Everything else in the ethnography and the history
Mm-hmm.
all kind of moved along. And then finally that came like about the time, maybe even after we brought it to the faculty board. And then that's what the book became famous for. Then there are other people who just have the idea, and it's like they're just working to try and kind of pull it out so it's actually there. And it's a kind of mystery to me, and what makes people's questions about writing advice always difficult to answer,
Right.
because I feel like people just write differently. My partner,
Mm-hmm.
Kathy Davidson, she gets up and writes every morning, whether she has something to write or not. It's just like going to the gym or working out or something. It's like you have to stay in shape, you have to keep writing, and you make up questions that need solving so you can write through, like, what would that be like? Other people, like myself, I hate writing, so I'll like wait till I have the clearest, either the deadline or the clear idea of what I want to say, and then I'll try and write it out.
Mm.
So it's hard to, I don't think you could necessarily turn one kind of writer into another. So trying to figure out what kind of writer the person is while I'm talking to them, and then what kind of thing works and where what they're writing switches, is a really interesting part of the relationship, I think.
Great, thank you. So now we have a list of questions, which is great. Um, I'll start with maybe kind of clustering a couple of them uh, that are, I'll call maybe the differences questions. So one is what are the differences between a dissertation and a book, and are there resources and guidance? But then in a related question, how do second books differ from first books? And what advice would you give to second book authors? And there's a question similar to that, which is, can you talk about second book projects? What do
Yes,
they do that first books don't?
right. So just maybe I'll talk about the dissertation to book part first, and
Mhm.
then the second book, how it's different. So the genre differences between the dissertation and the book are, some parts are obvious. So we talked before about there being 6 people. You know who they are. If they agreed to be on your committee, it's usually ahead of actually writing the dissertation. So they've agreed to read it before you write it. But also, and also, you are doing your dissertation somewhere. So the people that you're serving on their committee at Columbia, if they had to put together a committee at UCLA, who would be
Mhm.
on it? If they were doing it at Berkeley, who would be on it? If they were doing it at Vanderbilt, who would be on it? If they were doing it at Chicago, who would be on it? And how would their work be different? Whereas for a book, it's supposed to address people as widely as possible.
Mhm.
And, some of those things might be less important in any given person's work. It's hard to ignore the actual 6 readers you have when you're writing. But to me, the most important thing is you write assuming people read to the end. And of course, I assume you've been on enough defenses to know not everyone does that, but you're still writing towards something that could add up to something, and could add up to the something being, oh, isn't this complicated? You know, nationalism, isn't it a complex
Mhm.
thing? Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. You know, like the dissertation work is the research, it's the interpretation, it's the ethnography, it's the archivalness, it's the thinking it through in a complicated way. Um, the So that's never the case with a book. Somebody's going to be standing around at MLA or Asian American Studies. They're going to be at the table. They're going to read a paragraph, or we tend to put the first chapter introduction of a book up online. Somebody's going to read that and go, wow, I can't wait to keep reading, or that's enough after they read a sentence or
Mhm.
3 sentences or a paragraph. So those things are very different, but also more is more. So if you make a point and you have 3 examples in Toni Morrison novels to make that point, everybody's like, wow, you did a lot of work here. Or if you're a historian and it's based on extra archival evidence, wow, you really got out there.
Mhm.
So in a book, though, if you give a statement and you back it up, and then you give another reason why it's true and another reason it's true, we're bored. We're like, okay, got that the first time. So a whole bunch of the assumptions about where the argument happens. So in a book, usually right up front. If there's an argument, what kind of writing there should be, what's the kind of pacing and rhythm. There's no responsibility really for rhythm or pacing in most dissertations I know of. Whereas in books, that's what keeps people working their way through them. So those are as different as can be. I like the two books by Bill Germano, William P. Germano, who was at Routledge for a long time and now is at Cooper Union. And they're both from Chicago. I like the one called Getting It Published, which is now maybe in its third or fourth edition. And there's also a dissertation to book one. And I think they're both ethnographically really accurate about what you have to do, what should be in a cover letter, what should be in a proposal, how to think about different publishers, all the kind of practical things, but also the conceptual push on your own work to really ask yourself, what's the idea you want to go with? Because you're really building, as you know, you're building a career, not just getting a book published. And one of the funny things I've seen happen many times is people often have the idea of the second book while they're writing the first book, but they get so caught up in being asked to go represent that first book over and over again that the idea they started with the second book doesn't turn out to be the second book at all, because you're going to be the expert on that. So what do you want to be the expert on? What do you want to be cited for having done and be seen as the person to go to for that thing? That's a very different kind of way of thinking about oneself and choosing what to emphasize in the book and what comes. I like to think of like what comes front stage of all the things you learned and what can be pushed a little more backstage that's kind of there for some of the people who might have been your dissertation readers, but doesn't need to be there for all the readers. So if you think about someone starting with a dissertation and then thinking, what do I want to keep? What do I want to get rid of? What's really my argument? What, and if I break away from the chapter order I have and really just want to convince people, what do they need to read? Does it need to be these chapters at all? So that might be the situation of the first book writer. There are lots of books, like including the two I just mentioned. There are panels at almost every conference. There's now like developmental editors and lots of people in business for various sad reasons about the lack of tenure track jobs, giving people advice about how to revise. And so it's a kind of known problem. When you get to the second book, often you have tenure. Sometimes you don't, but often you have tenure. But people assume you already wrote a book. So they're like, nah, you're on your own, pretty much, as if it were going to be the same thing. But like I'll compare it to learning to ride a bicycle, Oh, we taught you how to ride this bicycle. Why do we need to teach you how to ride another bicycle? It's just like ride a bicycle. But with books, on the second book, you're not revising anything, which means you didn't start with something that you got advice, hopefully, from some helpful mentor who was like, don't make it that topic, it'll be too small and you won't have any impact. No, don't try and do that, you'll never finish. Everything about shaping the topic and the approach, giving you feedback on the initial versions that you got from a dissertation advisor or advisors, you don't get on the second book. There's no plateau of the finished dissertation where you can say, hey, if somebody needs that, it's over there in the dissertation, and then you could pick and choose. There's not all these panels or advice things. And often I feel as biopolitically difficult as the tenure process can be as a form of discipline and governance, it does also give one a timeline by which one has to have a book done. A lot of times, and you see this often from, and it's raced and gendered, of associate professors who get called on to do lots of committee work and other forms of service work in the profession, and have to put their own second book on hold while they're doing all those things. It hasn't really kind of cohered into a project. So you'll have a project that keeps shifting along, and somebody will read something and be like, oh, I just read blah, blah, blah. So now I need to, like, maybe I should do more of this. So you have like this kind of shifting idea of a project, or several projects, one of which might turn into the second book. Or in another bad thing, people go back to their published articles that are beyond the first book. Like, maybe it's a jigsaw puzzle, and if I rearrange them, they'll have a chapter arc magically, and then the introduction will all come together. So that those forms of like, what's the process of starting from scratch? How do you commit to something that's the idea of the second book enough that you can figure out what the work would need to be, make enough of a screenplay that you can figure out what you need to know, be flexible enough to shift it as you learn things and do the research, which, by the way, most of us are then doing in our spare time instead of like as a grad student, like with lots of time and hopefully some funding support. What you need to shift as you learn things, that's a much different process. I think most editors, like, I'll send out way less for a second book than a first book, because it does mean something the person did the first book, and reviewers will know, like, oh, sure, I'd be glad to read so-and-so's second book. I love their first book. And then it'll take less to see like where they're on track and where they're not really there yet. But I think it's a very, very different process, and people often have to put together structures for themselves that were more readily provided for them as kind of guiding structures on the first book. And that could be the writing groups, that could be accountability groups, that could be just a kind of feedback process between a couple of people trying to write at the same time. You're going through this and have been through it. Does that seem ethnographically accurate?
Yeah,
What would
I
you
think
have?
so. No, I think that's true. I think it's thinking about next steps in the project that shifts and changes, and it is different. I remember even thinking about the fashion book when I said, I think I pitched a different book to you, and you said, I think you didn't say what else do you have, but and then I said, well, what I did say was, well, if I could, the book that I would really want to write is this, and then you said to me, why don't you write that book? Why wouldn't you write that book? And so I think that it is a very different, it's just a different place that you are in. We have
And that's an
two,
important function that I love to be able to play.
yeah,
Even just to
yeah,
ask that question, because
yeah.
there's an author who I love, who had done two books that were kind of ethnographic approaches to very similar things. And then she came up with a third one that was kind of analogous. I was like, you could keep doing this and keep doing it well for a long time. Would you like to try something else? And the answer was actually, what she tried doing was going to a trade publisher and doing a successful version of that same form, but with a different readership. But just having somebody interrupt, like, oh, I guess I have to start another one and it's going to be the same. And
Yeah.
somebody who believes in you and wants you to be like as creative as you might be, that if I can be that person, then I feel really lucky.
Now we have two questions about length, actually. So one, Joshua was saying that it seems to me that books in the humanities are getting shorter, but maybe that's just a reflection of the fields I read. Is that actually the case? And then Aiden asking, how many chapters do you recommend for a first book? Is more than four okay? So a question about, is there an ideal length?
So one, I mean, we haven't talked much about the commercial parts of publishing, but at different points in my career, who you expected to buy books have been very different. So when I started, it was uh, just when Borders was getting started. There were still lots of independent bookstores, and my hope was to get all the books in independent bookstores so people who weren't academics could find them, or even academics could find them. When there was first Barnes & Noble and Borders competing, they had everything. So there were lots of books out there. As they started to contract and not carry any more books than they carry now, and Borders went out of business, then getting things that were teachable became more important. So I think part of the shorter book idea, which we've been doing, the Public Planet book series, started back in the late 1900s. So that was partly to make short things that could be taught. You could have an undergraduate class and teach. So you think, well, what do students read now? So is your idea that the book could be taught in a class? How long a book would you teach in a class? If it were a grad seminar, how long a thing would somebody read? So I think that's pushed books to be shorter. And then the non-academic book audiences, especially for things that have, I think, readerships that are like political publics in some way or another. What kinds of things would they read? But it's very different, based on what kind of book it is. So just to go back to Don's History of Stockton, that book would not have been better if it were shorter, because here it was telling the whole story of a community that was embraced by people whose families had still lived in the community or had been through the community. And all the texture and depth of what happened was part of what made it real. I don't think anybody ever told Robin Kelly well, maybe his editor did, but readers never told Robin Kelly that his Monk biography should be shorter. Because, like, here's Robin Kelly writing on Monk, one of the most important artists of the 20th century. And he knows all this stuff that he can tell. So it kind of depends on what the discipline is, what the genre is. I think that the number of chapters is a different question because it presumes how long a chapter is. So I like books that might have more chapters, but maybe the chapters are shorter. Or books could have fewer chapters, but the writing's more creative. So there's not really an ideal form, and getting out of that, excuse me, because it's a form of generational criticism. That's not the fault of the people in the generation, but the No Child Left Behindness of like, oh, there's a perfect form, and if I could achieve that, that'll be fine, which is really the holdover of modeling from earlier forms of the monograph. You think about, like, what does the book need to be successful? What does it need to convince people of what it's doing? And what's the form of that that's going to carry people through the book? That's the guide I would have. I do feel like if a book, we think of 100,000 words as a 300-page book. So that's probably longer than most people would teach, but it's not crazy. But we've had books that were really successful that were 450 pages, but they're books I know won a lot of prizes that also people would teach an article by the person or just the introduction because they think, oh, no one will ever read the whole thing. So it's trying to put together the form, the argument, the voice, the readership, and think about that as a kind of coherent set of decisions. Because often people say something like, oh, I'd like it to be teachable. I think it'll be accessible to upper level undergrads, and be like, well, it's 150,000 words, but I can try and cut it down to 130,000 words. I'm like, oh, would you teach a 400-page book to your upper division undergrads? maybe, maybe Orientalism.
We only have a time for, I think, a couple of more, but and maybe we'll end with this question: what would you most love to publish that has never yet crossed your desk? But before that, I want to get to Claire's question, which is to the point of a book building a career. Is there any advice you could give to first-time authors about carving out time to give space for the kind of rumination and play with the manuscript that has been described tonight? So I feel like I'm at the end of my dissertation cool-off period, and my committee's suggesting that I more and more that having a book with a press will better my job market chances. So of course, we're also in this situation where because of what is happening with tenure track jobs and the market, that people are receiving some pressure to, okay, well, if you have a contract or if you have a proposal accepted. So maybe not so much about that, but Claire is asking, are there strategies for encouraging someone to use the summer to develop the book proposal? How can I be my own book's doula?
That's a good question. I feel like that advice from well-meaning faculty is misplaced, but understandable. I think like the idea that someone's going to have a book by the time they get on the job market is not realistic, really, even though it might be a wish. I mean, you see more, you've probably seen quite a few hundred job applications in the last couple of years. Are you looking to like choose somebody who's just starting out who already has a book, or you're trying to find the person who seems like they have the best upside and possibility as a scholar person in the department?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that there is that pressure that exists, but I think that it's that is having a book contract doesn't necessarily mean that you will have a better chance on the market. I do hear your question though, Claire, in terms of, okay, well, even if it's not about getting a contract, how does one actually create? And I think especially just coming out a year that has been so disrupted, and after several years of uncertainty, especially if you're just finishing your dissertation and cooling off period, there was so much disruption in the last few years. But one thing I would say, just as a writer, is creating modes of support and accountability with colleagues or with friends. There was there have been times when I really need to get writing done where it's actually friends that I had from graduate school, where we would have just accountability, where we would all log in and log the writing that we did, and it was like 30-45 minutes a day, and that is it, just to get yourself started. And I think that small things like that, starting a writing group, setting up deadlines, maybe not with the pressure of I need to get a book proposal done at the end of the summer, but starting with something like, okay, maybe just to make it more playful, which it seems to be what you want to do, can you move a little bit forward in the manuscript? Can you think about how you would approach this project differently, and creating steps that are a little bit more manageable than book proposal at the end of the summer, which can, I think, feel very difficult.
The other thing I think is to be brave. And there are certain patterns that you can look for in your own writing when you're trying to say what it's about. Like, I want to contribute to the conversation on, and ask yourself, well, what is my contribution? And you can really kind of question yourself, can you state what you want to argue as an argument? Or if it's a more effective lesson that you want people to get, what that is, and can you put it into a couple of clear sentences? Because that's something that will help on the job market. And also the kind of pushing yourself to get there helps you get the idea that other people will go like, wow, that's really smart. I hadn't thought of that. That's really superb. And that's going to do more with committees who are looking at 100 different things than, oh, I talked to this person at MLA and I've been in touch with this editor since. It's like, okay, that's good. But getting your idea together, I think, would be, and trying to be And that could be an accountability thing too. Like, is this an argument? Is this, does this feel new enough? Is really great.
So maybe as our Ken, what would you most love to publish that has never yet crossed your desk?
Well, there's something I came in with, and then something I'm hoping is crossing my desk now. And they both have to do with sound. So when I came in, I had been on the south side of Chicago, around the University of Chicago, for 14 years. And there were all these older African American community members on the same student radio station I was on. And there was a kind of local, in the bars on the corners, form of jazz that was very popular. That was at the time like organ tenor combos and a different kind of like what you would expect if you went on Sunday night to a bar and heard jazz. And the history of that felt really untold to me. And that you had so many histories around avant-gardism and very little about the popular. So I had really hoped that somebody would be doing an ethnography of fandom. So it would be like the people who were the listeners who were going out to bars. Because there was one guy I knew from the station. He was like, when he was much older at the time, which is even much older now, but he was like, when bebop started, it was just a better, it was just a better rhythm. It was just a better, that was the new rhythm. That was the better thing for dancing. So it was, even though it was in the jazz histories as an avant-garde move, that was kind of deconstructive or reconstructive. It was more like, just the same way for a dance. You'd be like, oh, there's the new rhythm for this year. So I would like more of that. I feel like on the fashion subject, the number of like everyday life fashion things that, I could watch a million TikToks about. And yet if you think like, so where are our cultural studies of that with the same attention and wisdom and stuff that you could have for photography or film or other forms of visuality? Not there. And then I was just at a manuscript workshop for Emily Young down at Duke. So she has some of this, which I'm really excited about. But I've been looking for an ethnography of sound as an everyday. So I'm right here at 22nd and 2nd in New York. You might have heard sirens as our conversation went by. If I were in Durham at Duke University Press, perhaps you would have heard cicadas. What's the everyday of where things take place? How do we see that as a kind of cultural and historical space, the way we might look at music or other sound? And I feel like that's a kind of ethnographic possibility that people have gestured toward, but has rarely opened up. Those are three things.
Amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's been so great to be here with you. Ken and I are looking forward to seeing your projects as they develop and to seeing your books. We wish you a peaceful and restful summer, one that is generative, and we look forward to seeing your work in the world.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Denise. You were really just the best to do this with. I just really enjoyed it a lot, and I hope it was helpful to everyone, and wishing you all a really great summer.
Me too.
Thank you. Have a great night.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.